Chapter 1, Sex Research Methods. In this chapter, we're going to focus on some of the pioneers that are responsible for our understanding in sex research. Let's start with an understanding of how sexuality has changed over time. Advances in the biomedical research and various sciences are responsible in large part for advances in the study of sexuality. There was a sexual revolution in the 19th and 20th century, and this really made sex research a more respectful arena of study, in large part because sex research is associated with reproduction, and that's all part of anatomy and physiology. So there are many researchers that came to the forefront in studying various avenues of sexuality. It became less shameful. And initially, the research started with an emphasis on anatomy and physiology. So let's take a look at one of the initial pioneers. His name was Richard von Krafft-Ebing. And Richard Krafft-Ebing was a German physician. And Krafft-Ebing took a psychiatric approach. So when Krafft-Ebing conducted his research, he ended up looking at a number of individuals, and he observed 237 cases. In these cases, he observed a lot of activity and sexual behavior that was deemed to be abnormal. So from his case histories, he wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis. And in this book, he observed what he called sex disorders. He observed abnormal sexual behavior, and this included fetishes, as well as a number of other atypical forms of sexual expression. Krafft-Ebing is responsible for providing a lot of clinical definitions that are used to describe atypical forms of sexual expression today. For instance, some of these that were clinically named by Krafft-Ebing include transvestism, necrophilia, fetishism, bestiality, masochism, and sadism. Masochism is when an individual gets some type of gratification, often erotic pleasure, from being physically hurt in controlled circumstances. In contrast, sadism is when an individual gets gratification or sexual arousal from inflicting pain. So some of these are considered atypical today, and Krafft-Ebing is responsible for providing clinical definitions of them. As a matter of fact, some of the disorders mentioned by Krafft-Ebing are still included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And that is ultimately a compilation provided by psychiatrists, professionals in the field, to describe what constitutes as normal and abnormal types of behavior. So Krafft-Ebing certainly was a contributor. However, he still has room for criticism. Many critics are critical of Krafft-Ebing because was he really a researcher that was out for an individual's best interest to diagnose and provide names for clinical disorders? Or was he trying to pose his own code of conduct on these individuals? Our next researcher was a very controversial researcher named Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud was a psychiatrist. And with Sigmund Freud, he was an individual that placed a lot of emphasis on the unconscious mind. He had very unconventional views on sexuality. Sigmund Freud, he thought that thoughts, dreams, behavior was indicative of one's sexual experiences. And there were things like where your eyes would wander or slips of the tongue, what you would dream about. Those were really you suppressing some type of perversion or some type of behavior, and that was influenced in one shape or fashion. So Sigmund Freud, he thought that desires to a atypical target, at least at the time, he thought, well, like that was probably due to how you were developed and how you were raised, your upbringing. And he thought that if things could affect you on a very early age, then that could certainly place a strong effect on how you developed into adulthood. As a matter of fact, Sigmund Freud thought that by the time an individual was about 6 years old, they could not be changed, and that their adult sexuality was rooted in their childhood. So he placed a very strong emphasis on this. Sigmund Freud pioneered determinism, an explanation that adult feelings, frustrations, and behavior developed from childhood experiences and could not be changed. And although that certainly has areas of criticism, Sigmund Freud ultimately added psychoanalysis. This is an approach towards sexuality that looks at an individual's human personality, growth, development, and psychotherapy. Sigmund Freud, because he would ultimately investigate individuals with consultation, he provided a means in which researchers could get compensated for some of the work that they were doing. Our next researcher was an individual named Magnus Hirschfeld. And with Magnus Hirschfeld, this was a very active and outspoken homosexual in Germany. Now, it's important to note that Magnus Hirschfeld was incredibly active, and he was outspoken, and he wanted to promote ideas in sexuality. However, he was especially interested in promoting and furthering research on homosexuality. He was a very active researcher with pamphlets, booklets, books, various publications, over 200 of them. And he developed the first journal of sexuality. Now, this is significant because the Journal of Sexuality enables professionals in the field to collaborate some of their research and some of their data. So individuals that are professionals are those that can contribute and sharpen each other as they're conducting research. Professionals in the field could offer constructive criticism. They could offer areas in where they should research and also areas in where they should improve. And this is significant in all sciences, to have scientific journals for professionals in the field to advance their ideas. Hirschfeld formed the Institute of Sexology in Berlin. He believed that homosexuals were a third sex, a biologically separate gender. And Hirschfeld also had written a book called What People Should Know About the Third Sex. Unfortunately for Magnus Hirschfeld, he wasn't widely accepted. And the reason for this is Magnus Hirschfeld lived in Berlin, Germany in the early 1900s. His Institute of Sexology in Berlin was ransacked by the Nazis, and Hirschfeld fled Germany for fear of his life. Hirschfeld, however, differed with Freud on how homosexuals developed. Hirschfeld thought that there were two centers in the brain. In males, there was one neural center responsible for female preference, and in females, there was a neural center responsible for male preference. Hirschfeld thought that individuals were born with both neural centers. However, males, one of those neural centers grew and developed for preference to females, and in females, the other neural center grew and developed, and that was responsible for their preference to males. Hirschfeld thought that perhaps sometimes early in development, the wrong neural center or the opposite neural center developed. If development was derailed in some way, one of these neural centers is responsible for same-sex preference. So Freud differed. So they had two different perspectives. Freud, on the other hand, again thought that an individual's previous experiences were responsible for their sexual orientation. Our next sex researcher is perhaps best known by the American public. This is Dr. Alfred Kinsey. And Dr. Alfred Kinsey, he was a PhD from Harvard University, He was a very brilliant mind. He was a professor at Indiana University, and he taught zoology. He was a professor that students trusted and admired and looked up to, and he was a professor that students would often go to with questions. They trusted Dr. Kinsey, and they would often go to him with questions about marriage and reproduction. So Dr. Kinsey was popular and highly respected amongst students. So being that Dr. Kinsey was a zoology professor, students would often come to him and ask questions for advice on sex and marriage, and Dr. Kinsey had a couple of interesting thoughts. Dr. Kinsey was concerned about the naivety of some of these students, many of which were college educated. They understood some fundamental concepts in science and biology, and they were asking relatively naive and simple questions. Whereas others, he thought, those are interesting questions. And being a scholarly and very educated individual, when he didn't know the answer to these questions, Dr. Kinsey wanted to do some research to get the answers for some of the students that would bring to his attention. Dr. Kinsey, upon investigating some of the research in various aspects of sexuality, he found something astonishing. When Dr. Kinsey went to identify some of the research in the field of sexuality, he found that there was none. And because there was a lack of depth in the field of sexuality, this prompted curiosity and interest. And because students were comfortable with Dr. Kinsey, he had large classes, he was able to take a sociological approach, and he was able to conduct a lot of research on his own. That gained a lot of popularity, and Dr. Kinsey again became best known to the American public for his research. In 1947, Dr. Kinsey became the director of the first United States Institute for Sex Research. Dr. Kinsey was incredibly productive, and Dr. Kinsey would publish sex research called the Kinsey Reports, and these would fly off of the shelves. And the American public was absolutely blown away at some of the research that Dr. Kinsey had found. So he conducted his own research. He did lots of surveys, cross-studies, and cross-studies are when individuals study a group of individuals at a particular point in time. Kinsey investigated over 16,000 sex histories through his research. So Dr. Kinsey had an awful lot of data. In contrast, longitudinal studies are where one or few individuals are studied over long periods of time. With longitudinal studies, this is interesting to note that these have their advantages and disadvantages with cross studies. With longitudinal studies, an advantage is you could follow up with the patients over longer periods of time. However, it's few patients, so you're not really able to apply broad data amongst a wide demographic. So with cross studies, the advantage is you get to study a whole lot greater number of individuals. Now, Kinsey Reports and seminars eventually led him to teach a course that gained much popularity. Dr. Kinsey would often do speeches, he would often do presentations, and here we have Dr. Kinsey at Berkeley, speaking right here to a very large audience. Some of the research that he would discuss and publish in his Kinsey Reports included 37% of men engaged in sex with another male. And again, this was to the point of an orgasm. That number was absolutely profound. Another was that 10% of males were homosexual. Remember, this is in the mid-1900s. So for Dr. Kinsey to have this statistic, that was far, far greater than the American public had thought would be homosexual. In his research, Dr. Kinsey also published that 50% of males had an extramarital affair by the end or by the age of 40 years old. One other very interesting result that Dr. Kinsey found was that more educated people, the higher they've moved up in their academic career, they tend to masturbate more frequently. And again, this was contrary to what the American public thought. They had thought perhaps that was a primitive activity, and as you become more scholarly, educated, you wouldn't engage in something like that. However, Dr. Kinsey found his research showed the opposite. There was a problem. Although Dr. Kinsey was incredibly popular, conducted a whole lot of research, the American public was very interested in what Dr. Kinsey had published in his Kinsey reports. He had a very, very big problem in that he had a demographic bias. His subjects were young, white, middle-class males, typically under the age of 35, pretty well off, and they were all in college. So individuals that were being conducted in his studies or individuals that were studied, it's very difficult to apply their experiences and his results to the entire demographic of the country. Because some of his research did not coincide with societal norms at the time, he had found that individuals engaged in sometimes bisexual behavior, sometimes homosexual behavior, sometimes in incidents of homosexual behavior, but they were heterosexuals for the most part. Dr. Kinsey developed the sexual orientation continuum. And this is a scale, 0 to 6, 0 exclusively heterosexual, no homosexual incidences, where you could move through and have few homosexual instances. At 3, you would be bisexual. At 5, 6, you would be primarily homosexual with a few heterosexual instances. And this was a continuum to describe a variation in one's sexual orientation. Our next group of researchers are among the most quoted researchers today. This is Masters and Johnson. William Masters, a gynecologist, a doctor, and Virginia Johnson, a psychologist. They conducted a lot of their research from the 1960s to 1990. Now, it's important with Masters and Johnson. William Masters was a doctor, highly educated, and William Masters thought it's important that we're objective in our research. Rather than having a demographic bias like Kinsey had, it's important to use instruments. It's important to quantify the data, measure it with the appropriate equipment. And William Masters thought, it's probably important that I hire on a female to get a female's perspective and be absolutely as objective as possible. So William Masters hired Virginia Johnson, who was a psychologist, to add her perspective and make the research more well-rounded. Later on, they ended up getting married. So Masters and Johnson had a different look on sexuality. They wanted to be as scientific as possible. They wanted to remove any bias, and they wanted to be objective. They were educated, they were objective, and they were eager to conduct research. However, they had a very big problem. Although they were highly qualified, educated, and eager to conduct research, they lacked one thing. They lacked patience. Remember, Dr. Alfred Kinsey, he was a professor that students trusted. He was able to conduct surveys, cross-studies. He was able to get a number of subjects that would participate in a confidential fashion. However, with the type of research that Masters and Johnson wanted to conduct, well, this involved them measuring actual patients. The patients wouldn't be confidential. This was very difficult for them to get patients. So they did the only thing that they could do. Initially, they got prostitutes. They got self-selected individuals. And initially in their research, Masters and Johnson had identified these subjects aren't what we would constitute as normal. They had identified sexual dysfunctions. in some of these subjects that they had studied, they had determined, you know what, some of what we're seeing does not constitute as normal. They have dysfunctions, sexual dysfunctions, which are physical, psychological, and or interpersonal problems that may impair with sexual desire, arousal, or response. This is where Masters and Johnson really need a lot of credit, because they proposed that sexual dysfunctions developed from maladapted learning, and these could be corrected with the appropriate teaching and reinforcement. This differed from Sigmund Freud. Remember, Sigmund Freud thought that dysfunctions were a result of past experiences. They couldn't be changed. Masters and Johnson proposed they could be changed with the correct teaching and with the correct reinforcement. So Masters and Johnson, they were objective, they would monitor, they would film, they would record, and they would observe. They would observe people masturbating. They would observe people engaging in sexual activity. And they would quantify measurements. They would look at heart rate, blood pressure, vasocongestion, which is blood flow to the genitals. They would conduct all kinds of research to be as objective and quantify their data to provide numbers to support their claims. They observed over 10,000 orgasms. In 1966, they wrote The Human Sexual Response. This is still used today, however it's modified. In 1970, Human Sexual Inadequacy. In 1979, Homosexuality in Perspective. And in 1988, Heterosexuality in the Age of AIDS. Let's take a look at some of the equipment that's used to quantify sexual behavior. This right here is a photocell known as a photoplethysmograph. This little light-sensitive device, this is placed into the vagina during sexual activity. And this could measure transparency of engorged tissues with blood in the vaginal area. In males, as males get an erection, blood flows to the penis, causing the penis to get erect. The same type of thing occurs in females. Blood flows to the genitals. Blood flows into the clitoris. The labia deepen in color. And this device measures any change in engorged tissues, which would be indicative of sexual arousal. In males, here we have a device that could measure, well, this cuff could be wrapped around the penis, and as males become aroused and the penis increases in length and girth, this could quantify the measurements. Something important to note. Although Masters and Johnson were also very productive, although they were objective in their sex research, they observed these individuals and they took notes. They would quantify the research. Certainly the presence of these researchers that are watching individuals engage in sexual activity could adversely affect one's sexual behavior and their sexual activity. Also, Masters and Johnson, they took a great deal of interest in anatomy and physiology. They looked at orgasms. They look at how the body responds. And males and females, although they're very similar in some respects, they also have some notable differences. So Masters and Johnson, they were sometimes criticized for not adding cultural attitudes in their research on sexuality. And studying sexuality has provided great insights on myths, sexual differences, and bias. Male bias has occurred for a very long period of time, and it still exists. It's prevalent in some cultures over others today. The feminist movement challenges many areas of bias in sexuality. Sheer Height is a sex educator and feminist. She criticized Masters and Johnson for not adding cultural perspectives in studies. For instance, during their studies, while they looked through the human sexual response cycle, they looked at how the body changed as it went through increased blood pressure, excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then resolution. They developed a human sexual response cycle with those various phases. Well, females don't always experience an orgasm. In many instances they do, however, certainly females can go through a sexual response cycle without even achieving an orgasm. Their bodies are different. They don't always respond the same physiologically. That difference needs to be accounted for, and initially it wasn't always accounted for in research. So Schierheit focused on female sexuality. She fought against male bias. Now, advances in research, biomedical research focuses on underlying mechanisms of sex, and this has practical impacts, like hormone-based contraception and abortion. Advances in these areas are in large part due to sex research, drug treatments for reproductive cancers, drug treatments for male sexual dysfunction, methods to prevent, cure, and treat STDs, including AIDS, technologies to treat infertility in men and women, and improve safety of pregnancy and childbirth. We have a lot less deaths in mothers today during childbirth than we did 100 years ago. The success of having children without any birth defects due to complications during delivery has also decreased dramatically. There are a lot of practical and beneficial biomedical research advances due to studying sexuality. Now, modern imaging technologies have broadened human sexuality studies, especially in terms of brain function. When we take a look at this diagram here to the bottom, this is a PET scan in females. Upon arousal and stimulation in females, areas that are yellow and red are active during sexual arousal. Areas that are blue have decreased activity. This can help show areas of the brain that are active during sexual activity in females and areas that are inactive in females. Brain circuitry and brain activity is looked at in males, in females, in transgender individuals, in homosexual individuals, and brain circuitry is an area of active research. This is showing how anatomically individuals may have similar structures. However, if their brain circuitry doesn't necessarily coincide, sometimes people may identify differently. Genetic studies also enable diagnosis of certain fetal abnormalities. Genetic studies can be done while a woman is pregnant, where her blood can be drawn, and a genetic analysis can be taken from any fetal DNA that is entered into the mom's bloodstream. There's also ways that are a little more invasive, like an amniocentesis or chorionic villi sampling, that could provide insight and genetic material for doctors to investigate. These again are also important to understand if there are any abnormalities during development. Current research again attempts to home in on genes that influence traits like an individual's sexual orientation. And this is research that's currently being investigated. Now, biomedical researchers, when they're conducting research, they often use non-human animals to study their reproductive systems and sexual behavior. Most advances that were previously listed were made possible by research using laboratory animals, especially mice and rats. A great deal of information has been derived from work with non-human species. This is important for understanding how hormones and neurotransmitters can affect the brain. If drugs are administered to humans, there's usually laboratory trials with mice or rats to determine if it's safe to apply to humans first. So when conducting research, there are independent variables. These are things that are changed by the experiment. For instance, if a researcher wanted to find out how much dosage of Viagra they should give to patients, Viagra itself would be the independent variable. The dependent variable would be things that are affected by changes in the independent variable. So if Viagra is the independent variable and dosages would fluctuate, that could affect arousal level differently. Arousal level is dependent on Viagra. In other words, arousal level, the dependent variable, is dependent on the independent variable. When conducting samples, it is not possible to census or sample or experiment the entire population or sometimes even large populations. So smaller groups are used to be representative samples of larger groups. And random samples, they need to be taken. Random samples need to be taken, so this is a good representation of the entire community or demographic that's being studied. So these are different methods of study that are commonly used in sexuality. Let's go through these. Let's go through some brief descriptions, advantages, and disadvantages. First, we have a case study, clinical research. This examines a subject or small group in depth. Advantages. Well, in-depth explorations of behaviors, feelings, thoughts. Disadvantages. Well, sometimes individuals don't always remember. Sometimes it's very difficult to generalize the findings from one or few individuals. Surveys. This is where individuals, they could take surveys where the researcher can conduct a large amount of data taken from a large number of individuals at a given point in time. Advantages. Individuals are often willing to participate in surveys. You can get a lot of data very quickly. Problems is that this has a very, very big demographic bias. For instance, if a survey was given at a liberal college in a sexuality class or a psychology class, and let's say 100 students were polled in the survey and data was gathered, probably that wouldn't be a good representation of the entire city or the entire demographic in which that was conducted. If you were to give that very same survey to 100 people coming out of a mosque or a church, they may have different perspectives. So depending on where the survey is administered, that could certainly affect the types of responses that individuals would provide when answering the survey. Demographic bias is a big one. Also, sometimes people answer inaccurately. After all, most of the time surveys are anonymous. A direct observation. This is what Masters and Johnson did. They observed individuals directly. And this virtually eliminates the possibility of data falsification, because after all, they could measure respiration rate or blood pressure or transparency of tissues. The problem is, the individuals being studied, their behavior may be adversely affected, because after all, they're being watched. And individuals, they may be uncomfortable if a doctor or a researcher is watching them engage in a sexual encounter. An experimental method. This is when subjects are presented with certain stimuli, like drugs, for instance, maybe birth control, maybe Viagra. This provides controlled environments where you could physically monitor the exact dosage of the drug that's being administered. However, artificial laboratory settings may adversely influence or bias the subject responses. If individuals know that they're being tested, well, they may respond differently by power of suggestion. So each of these has their advantages and disadvantages, and they need to be considered when sex research is being conducted. So sex studies can be difficult to conduct. Considerations include how were samples obtained? Was there consent or deception in order to get participants? What's the selection process? Sample size, how many individuals are willing to participate? Are there stereotypes? Is there any kind of bias? These are all important considerations. So having gone over some of the pioneers and initial researchers, we've come a very long way in our understanding of sexuality. Sex research or sexology is interdisciplinary. This has become an academic discipline in its own right. However, this demands expertise in many disciplines, including biology, psychology, anthropology, and sociology. You'll find that sex studies are often incredibly comprehensive. So in our next lecture, we're going to take a look at the function and location of female reproductive anatomy.